I'd like to thank Liora for inviting me and Dr. Moore for his kind moderation and presentation. Also thank you, Rachel, for organizing for us this conference. We have heard in general 20 years after the Washington Principles. This presentation is going to be a little bit more practical. We are going to concentrate on a specific art restitution case of Emma Vodka. In German they say Vodka, the Americans say Budge. All the images that you see in the presentation are from the collection of Emma Vodka, so they're not just from Google. What are we going to talk about? So we are going to start our discussion in presenting the family of Henry and Emma Vodka, their collection, what happened to the collection, their forced auction in 1937, and then we will discuss after the Washington Principle what happened as part of the restitution. We will see what did the museums do, private owners, auction houses. So we are going to see, in a way, a series of successes of restituted pieces. And then I'm going to discuss some questions raised by certain museums, which obviously I don't really like in particular. And we will see why they are not the right questions and how can we answer those questions, firstly, within the framework of the discussion, and then out of the box, so changing the paradigm and seeing a different view how to look on the case. And then we'll conclude with my own summary for this specific case of the Washington Principles and how they are practically observed in this case. So first, let's discuss the collectors, a couple, Henry and Emma Vodka. Henry was from Frankfurt, originated from those Jewish families like the Rothschilds, who were in the banking industry. A lot of German Jews moved from Germany to the US, and they were very influential in the banking, in building the banking system in the US and financing the railways. So he amassed a big fortune. He married his wife, born from Hamburg, also Jewish, and they lived in the US, in New York. After he retired, they decided to move back to Germany, but not to his hometown of Frankfurt, but to her hometown of Hamburg. And we will see the collection. What is interesting to note, they gave a lot of money for charity, and they established 2 or 3 elderly homes in Frankfurt and in Hamburg, dedicated for elderly people, both Jews and Christians. 2 of the 3 are still existing in Frankfurt and in Hamburg, and they are some of the Vodka heirs. I mean, I always call them the children of Emma Vodka because they didn't have any natural children. So these Stiftung, these foundations still exist today. This is where they live in Hamburg. As you can see, a very nice villa. The golden mirror hall is their living room. And that's today was moved from the villa, from the palace in Hamburg, was moved to the museum in Hamburg. The villa is used today as the music high school of Hamburg. On the bottom of the slide you see what would have looked like her car. We know it from the Nazi documentation because an inventory was made, and so we know exactly what kind of cars she had. The property in Hamburg is very extant. When they purchased it, when they rebuilt it, they bought all the land in the surroundings. They had a huge garden, and they had another house for their driver. So you can see they lived in a very grand lifestyle. What happened after her death? She died in Henry died, as we said, in 1928. Emma died in 1937. And eventually, her collection was put under the hammer for auction in the Berlin auction house of Paul Graupe. Graupe himself was Jewish, and you may ask how was he allowed to act as an auctioneer as late as 1937? And the answer is that he was important for the Reich because he was his auction house had a very good reputation, and therefore, because a lot of Jewish collectors were forced to sell their collection, the Nazis enjoyed that, and they wanted him to continue his work because a lot of buyers came from out of Germany, and they paid in foreign currency, in Devisen, from the US, from Switzerland, and so on. And this was important for the Nazis because at that time there was were limitations on foreign currency. Foreign currency is going to be a main topic also for the Vodka case. So he was allowed to continue his work as an auctioneer. He was famous for preparing very nice catalogs, usually prepared by the experts from the Berlin museums with a lot of images. The Emma Vodka catalog was his last catalog. The auction was scheduled for September, but before the auction took place, he fled to Paris. It was already quite late, so one of his employees, Lange, took over the business. The auction was delayed a few weeks. It was held in October, and Graupe was no longer there. Some of the collection was sold in a second auction in December '37. On the way, I thought, I mean, it's to have an auction in October and then to sell the rest of the collection in December. That's very fast. Usually, I mean, you have a gap between the two auctions. So you could see that this auction has all the characteristics of what we call today the Jew auction. I brought with me the catalog of the second auction, the original catalog, so you can see inside there is even an absentee bid form. So the auction was a pretty big deal. Not too many people knew about Emma Vodka. I mean, she was living in Hamburg. She was not very famous. And when people saw the catalog and the extent of the collection, potential buyers came from all over the world, including Dutch museums, American museums. They came to Berlin to buy. In both auctions, we have over 1,200 items. So, I mean, when Dr. Moore mentioned that we registered around 4,000 objects, I mean, so you can see that for one particular collection, you have over 1,000 objects, not necessarily paintings. And this is what's interesting about this case, is that most of the people, she didn't have a huge collection of paintings. I think the paintings in part were chosen by her husband, who didn't have such a great artistic taste as she did. So they are not really the best, but the porcelain, the silver, the tapestries, the furniture, she collected only the best. She was advised by experts from the Hamburg Museum, and we will see later she had, I would say, almost an unlimited budget, so she was able really to buy whatever she wanted. Now, she made, I think somebody talked, I think Victor Feldman talked about it yesterday, about the tendency of German Jews to write their wills and then change them many times, writing codicils and so on. I think she had over 20 codicils. And of course her will is like, I don't know, 30 pages or so. And to that tradition, she made a lot of changes. At the end, she left them. At the beginning, she planned to donate the villa and the collection to the city of Hamburg. She wanted the villa to be like an outpost of the Hamburg Museum, but she noticed what was going on in Germany after 1933, especially after the Nuremberg laws in 1935, so she continued to amend her will. Finally, in the last version, she says, I'm leaving everything to a group of 13 heirs, including the foundations mentioned before. The heirs are mostly relatives of her husband and herself. And she advised against selling the collection in an auction inside Germany because she saw what was going on, she saw all the forced sales, she understood that the prices will be low and the money will not go to the heirs. She also stipulated that Jewish executors should be appointed. She named 4, and if they are to be replaced, only by executors who are Jewish. I would say that today her estate is managed by the court in Hamburg, by today's court in Hamburg, and she has a Jewish executor from Hamburg today. So the estate is still open 80 years later. Okay, so people would say, how would you find the pieces? How would you find a piece of silver, a piece of porcelain? She put labels, stickers on her collection. Of course, one can easily scratch off the label, and some people, of course, do that, but occasionally we have pieces which are untouched, and we see the original label. You see here in the small picture, Harlequin porcelain piece. And you see to the right of that piece, you see the base of that porcelain piece, and on the bottom you see the Vodka label, and you can see, I think, the number 854, and that's the number of that particular piece from the 1937 auction. That particular piece was found in the museum in Boston, in the MFA, and it was eventually restituted or bought back by the museum in Boston. On this slide you see some of the places in Europe where artworks from the Vodka collection were found. Of course, we found also pieces in the US and also in the UK, so I mean the slide is not complete. I would just mention that the Vodka collection, we discussed Professor Vella discussed the restitution committees. So in the Vodka case, we have positive decision from the Dutch Restitution Committee, from the Austrian Restitution Committee, and from the UK panel, as well as a piece restituted from the Zurich Museum, which is owned by the government. So in a way, that's also a national decision. Just to open brackets, because I promised Professor Hammerstein would talk about the Dutch case, we received 2 statues that were in the Provincial Museum in The Hague, in a positive decision by the Dutch Restitution Committee, what is called a binding opinion. This is a binding opinion is where a piece is found not in the national collection of the Netherlands, the NK, but in a museum, and we are pending. We are waiting for decisions for other pieces from the Dutch Restitution Committee. We will see those pieces later. All the pieces which are restituted to the estate, to the current estate of Emma Vodka, as I said, managed by her executor, and the proceeds are divided between the heirs of the original heirs. So I mean, we were talking about 13 original heirs, so you can imagine the number of current heirs. At the end of the presentation, I will say something about the current heirs. Where did the pieces go? Here you see an example, because when you have a collector like Emma Vodka who collected porcelain, a very high class and the top end of the porcelain, eventually it ends up with today's collectors who are porcelain collector. So the pieces are circulating in the art market through various collectors, and some of them end up in museums. So you see here that some of the pieces went to the Metropolitan Museum, they are still there. As I said, the Boston Museum is already settled, and also many of the German museums have already settled or restituted or compensated the Vodka estates. Here is an example of a case against the German museum. On the right, you see the piece itself, a piece of porcelain from the 18th century. It's a very small piece. It's like it's very tiny. I think you see it on the screen much larger than live. On the left of the slide, you see it's hard to read, but you see the results of the auction. the Nazis had a special institution called the Reichskunstkammer, which was responsible for administrating the art market. Every auction house had to give them a list of all the buyers from all the auctions. Sadly, not all of those records were kept, but in our case, for the year 1937, somehow they have it. And then you see that the purchaser of this piece in the 37 auction is the Schwerin Museum. And the piece is still there in the Schwerin Museum. Now, Schwerin is a small town in eastern Germany. And after the reunification of Germany, there was a possibility to file claims for property, which is known. This is what the claims conference did for unknown heirs. But what is unknown is that there was a possibility to file claims also for not real estate, for tangible, for movable objects. The claims conference started the claim against the Schwerin Museum. They won the claim, but the piece stayed as owned by the JCC, stayed in the Schwerin Museum until the current executor of the Vodka estate came into power, and he made an agreement together with the claims conference, the Schwerin Museum, that the piece be handed back to the Vodka estate. In that specific case, the Schwerin Museum wanted to buy it back, so they paid its value to the estate. So here you see a typical, maybe not a typical, but a case of restitution against a museum in Germany. In this case, I mean, what I put on the slide is the auction entry from Sotheby's, but the case was against the UK panel. The piece itself is a magnificent golden piece made to store salt. The piece was left by a silver collector to the Ashmolean Museum in the UK. The Vodka estate filed several claims against British museums, the V&A, the Berg collection in Scotland, and the Ashmolean Museum. The UK panel issued a very detailed recommendation, and the piece was returned to the Vodka estate and was put on auction. A lot of time, I have to say, we hear criticism against private owners and their lawyers, and they said it's what is called Shoah business, that it's all about money. But I think you understand, as I showed it before, when you have 13 heirs originally and you have dozens of heirs today, it's impossible to divide the proceeds in another way. Only an auction and then division of the proceeds through the stipulation of the will is possible. And so this piece was sold. Here you see an example of a settlement mediated through the auction houses. As mentioned before, there are restitution departments in Sotheby's and Christie's. Also, smaller auction houses are doing what they can, and when someone consigns a piece to an auction, and the auction house tells him the piece is looted, you have to settle with the estate. So there is a settlement, and you can read here, the painting is offered in cooperation with the estate of Emma Vodka. What is the problem in the case? The Nazis kept very detailed records of the case, and there is a very detailed OFP file, a Nazi fiscal authority documenting the case. And we are faced with a lot of questions from certain museums, and I wrote down the questions. Was it a normal auction, perhaps in a state? What happened to the proceeds, and so on? And I mean, the image here is seen. I mean, these magnificent silver pieces are in the Rijksmuseum, and the case is still pending with the Dutch. How can we answer those questions within the framework? So, I mean, a certain museum would say, okay, there was an auction, you have to pay inheritance tax. Sounds very legal, okay? The auction money was paid for inheritance tax. When you see the balance, you see that the inheritance tax worth 2 million Reichsmark, although a huge sum, is not a very big sum of the whole estate. So even financially, it was not needed to sell the collection to pay the taxes. What is also interesting, the Nazis did things which are illegal even according to German rules, laws. First they levy taxes, and then they steal the property. So you end up paying taxes for a property you don't get. And of course this is illegal. Also, some of the estate was in a Swiss bank account, I would say the majority of the estate, and many of the heirs were already living outside of Germany at that time. They immigrated to the US. So why would a US heir pay taxes to Germany for an estate in Switzerland? Of course, this is not legal. So we can answer the questions asked by the museums within the framework of the existing Nazi documents. And we can show that the auction was a forced auction, there were no reserve price, the taxes, the inheritance was illegal. Another legal thing is that according to German law, the heirs are supposed to pay the inheritance tax, not the estate. If the estate is not divided, it doesn't have to pay the taxes. And of course here, the taxes are paid. But I would like okay, another issue here, what happened to the proceeds? The auction proceeds went to a bank account, and the museum says, did the heirs have free access to the account, to the proceeds? Now here we see several examples of some of the Vodka heirs, cousins of Henry Vodka, and you would see on the left side, you see that Professor Siegfried Vodka is asking permission to use some of his money put in blocked accounts to buy a winter coat for 200 Reichsmark. His wife, I think that's even more cynical, she had to use the remaining of her funds to fund an elderly home. Where? In Theresienstadt. So she had to pay the Nazis from that block account to be sent to the Theresienstadt, where she perished. What happened after the war? What is interesting in this case is that the Nazi-appointed executor, which the Nazis appoint during the war to steal the Swiss account, was still active after the war. And when certain heirs made claims for Wiedergutmachung, for compensation after the war, they were confronted by this executor who said the claims are invalid. You cannot claim anything. I am the executor of the estate. I am the one who's supposed to file Wiedergutmachung claims. So the same one who stole the estate is the one who applies claims for Wiedergutmachung. Only a fraction, one family, had a German Jewish lawyer called Hugo Emmerich, who was, I think, must have been very talented because he didn't give up. He appealed and appealed to higher instances until all the cases were heard. What happened at the end? The villa, they made a claim to restitute the villa. It turns out that the same Nazi people who were in charge during the war were still in charge after the war, and they were in the Wiedergutmachung court, and they decided kind of a sham deal, and the heirs didn't get the money. For the Swiss depot, he was able to get a huge compensation only for the small share of the people he represented. In 2011, the city of Hamburg acknowledged the wrongdoing of what happened after the war, and they compensated the current heirs for the villa. There was one Wiedergutmachung case for an art piece, and it was rejected. Why it was rejected? I don't have do I have more? Another 2 minutes? Okay. Frankie, the executor, said in the court that the auction was a normal thing. And the West German court ruled in 1954, based on his testimony, on the one who stole the estate, that indeed the auction was a normal business thing, and therefore the piece was not restituted after the war. The same piece was restituted in 2015. Now I'm trying to get out of the same system of Nazi documents, and my point is that it's unfair to see the case only through the Nazi lenses. We have to look at the case through the lenses of the heirs, and we see contemporary documents for 2 families. This family, Adler and Weisenberg, came to the US. They came with nothing. They had to borrow money to open their doctor's clinic. So obviously, The question to the museum, did they get the proceeds? No, they came to the US completely penniless. So, but this we see from their family papers. We don't need to look at the Nazi papers to see this conclusion. Here you see another heir. The heirs have names, they have faces, they are not anonymous people, and you see a letter from the same Ella Butke, which was deported. She managed to hide the letter which was given after the war to her grandchildren, and you can read the letter, and she says, basically, I was forced to sign to waive all my property to the German Reich, and you should claim it after the war. And they are indeed part of the inheritance of Emma Butke. Just another minute. Conclusion 20 years after the Washington, we saw that we can get artwork, not only paintings. We saw different kinds of fair and solution museums, private owners, and auction house. I put the slide, the logo of Dr. Vodka, because he's a private, you know, the baking powders. I think that's a very nice example because he's a private owner who has a collection in his company, in his private collection. He hired Provenance researchers proactively looking for looted art in his private collection, and he made settlements on his own initiative with the Butke collection here. We managed to avoid litigation in this case, and I think I tried to persuade you that we shouldn't look at the restitution case only through the lenses of the Nazi papers, even if we have a 2,000-page file on our desk. And we saw that we have to look at the victim side, and that sometimes the decisions after the war were flawed because of the personalities of the people. Thank you very much.